Good afternoon and welcome to the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget in our discussion on the moral case for addressing America's fiscal crises. I apologize at the outset for my own voice. I have my hot tea here. I will do my best, but please bear with me. But in all seriousness, thanks to all who've helped put this event together. We have lunch available outside as well as several handouts for you to pick out. And many thanks for you all for coming today, as well as all who are watching the webcast. For we're gathered to talk about a very important topic. Even as spending bills move through Congress to fund the government and ease the impact of sequestration, Congress and the White House continue to grapple with difficult choices in trying to address our nation's fiscal woes. In fact, several House Republicans voted against the most recent bill, in part because it didn't pay down the federal debt enough. The federal debt, scheduled to continue to grow past $19 trillion by 2023 unless action is taken. The growing debt threatens to crowd out capital, raise interest rates, squeeze the government's ability to respond to needs, fund programs, defend the country, and meet its obligations. And today we're going to talk about it from a bit of a different angle than we sometimes have an opportunity to. That's why I'm so excited about the event today, is the chance to talk about some of the moral implications, the moral elements of the fiscal area. And the combination of the two, of talking about economics and faith, is particularly interesting to me. I've always thought of the debt as a moral issue since I worked for Senator Voinovich. I grew up in Ohio, and I worked for Senator George Voinovich for a while, and he would say over and over again that passing on a huge federal debt to the next generation is immoral because it limits the opportunities of future generations. The Urban Institute's 2013 KidShare report highlights some of the generational equity issues around this topic. They note, for example, that by 2023, the share of spending on children will drop as a percentage of budget from 10 to 8%, and as a share of the economy from just over 2 to 1.8%. And the percentage of the economy allocated to federal investments in children that year will be lower than it had been since 2002, where most all areas of spending on children other than health are projected to decline. But at the same time, between now and that same year, the percentage of interest spent on interest on the debt would rise from 6% to 14%. So the squeeze would impact future generations as less and less is available to spend on discretionary programs. Or take another example of defense or anything else. And now, as a pastor of a church, I also find this an interesting question. We had an adult education program at our church recently. We looked at the issue of debt, and one of our groups there, not just on the economic success of the country and future stability, but many parishioners were concerned about the impact of our fiscal trajectory on the most vulnerable citizens in our country. If a debt-related fiscal crisis were to take place, such as we had 5 years, or a crisis like what was 5 years ago, poor would be harmed the most. Many in our congregation were concerned about the ability of the government to help the most vulnerable citizens if discretionary spending is ultimately squeezed by the debt. I appreciated an op-ed by two leaders of Circle of Protection, another faith-based group that's interested in budget issues, who wrote last July that when Congress devised sequestration, it deliberately designed such a bad policy that would force to craft an intelligent alternative. However, Congress has not yet taken a meaningful vote to replace sequestration, they wrote, with a balanced and thoughtful plan that protects the most vulnerable, preserves economic opportunity, and restores fiscal responsibility. Allowing sequestration to be implemented and continues to be shows an abdication of leadership and a refusal to make tough choices. Leadership is overdue. The refusal to make tough choices and the need for leadership. Of course, how the debt problem is resolved ultimately matters, and people disagree on that. But there are three things, it seems to me, that people of faith from the left and the right seem to agree on when it comes to this topic. One is that leadership and tough choices, as the op-ed points out, are needed in this space. Secondly, that the debt is a problem that has to be addressed at some point. You just can't continue to go at the same trajectory we're headed. And third, that there are moral dimensions to this question. And so to help us address the fiscal and moral aspects of this important question, we have a wonderful group of panelists. Their bios are available outside, so I won't go into detail. But please join me in welcoming Marc Goldwein from the Committee for the Responsible Federal Budget, John Allen Newman, Senior Pastor of the Sanctuary at Mount Calvary Church, Dr. Jay Richards, a Distinguished Fellow at the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, Josh Good from the Values and Capitalism Project at the American Enterprise Institute, and Marc, the president of the Institute of Religion and Democracy. Please join me in welcoming our 5 speakers. Friends, thank you very much for taking time to share your wisdom with us today. Each will share their perspective, then we'll have an opportunity for your insights, and we'll have a chance to discuss and have questions. And so I want to say again, thank you for coming, for putting up with my voice, and I know you're in a treat. We are all in for a treat to hear the wisdom of these speakers. And so we'll begin with a basic framework from Marc Goldwein. Marc?
Thank you, David, very much, and thank you, everyone, for coming. My name is Marc Goldwein. I'm the Policy Director for the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. And those of you that don't know our organization, we advocate for a responsible federal budget, not surprisingly. I want to open up by just giving a fiscal lay of the land, explaining where we are. I'm going to give some bad news, some good news, and then some more bad news. Let's start with the bad news. Our debt levels are currently extraordinarily high by both historical and international standards. Economists tend to measure debt relative to the size of the economy because we think that's the best measure, so we call that the debt to GDP ratio. Right now, we're about twice our historical average, and we're the highest we've ever been since the aftermath of World War II. This is problematic for a lot of reasons that'll be discussed later. But there's good news, and I think 2 pieces of good news. One, we've made huge improvements since this issue really came to the forefront in 2010. By our calculations, we've reduced the deficit over a 10-year period by a total of $4 trillion. That is, if everything that we say we're going to do, we do over the next 10 years, there will be $4 trillion of deficit reduction relative to where we were. That comes from a variety of sources. It started with the Budget Control Act in 2011, which mostly focused on discretionary spending. It continued with revenue from the Fiscal Cliff Deal, the American Taxpayer Relief Act. And then we've had further deficit reduction as a result of the Murray-Ryan deal and the sequestration. This is good for our debt level because it actually gives us some breathing room. We now look at our projections, and for the first time next year, debt is going to start to decline a little bit as a share of GDP. In fact, by most projections, debt will be on a very slight downward path for the next 5 years, for the next 4 to 5 years. So that gives us some space. Our debt is no longer rising out of control. And the second piece of good news is we're actually starting to govern and make real decisions. Senator Murray and Congressman Ryan came together and found a way to replace some of the sequestration cuts with some intelligent mandatory spending cuts. And then just yesterday, the House passed what's called an omnibus bill, which actually made real decisions over where to find the wasteful spending in the defense program and in the non-defense programs, and prioritized, increasing in some areas, cutting in others. So we're starting to prioritize, we're starting to govern, and we've actually made substantial progress on the debt. But then I have 2 more pieces of bad news. The first is, largely we're doing the wrong kind of debt reduction. First of all, we've been doing it too fast. The economy is still recovering from, still very fragile, still recovering from the Great Recession. And most economists agree that if you cut deficits too quickly, it can actually take money out of the economy. People face higher taxes, they get less benefits, and so they spend and consume less. And that can be harmful to a fragilely recovering economy. Secondly, most of the policies we've pursued, not all but most, have been anti-growth. Instead of getting revenue from reforming the tax code or from reducing loopholes, we got it just from raising tax rates, which most economists will tell you it just creates bad incentives and worsens the existing problems in the current tax code. And instead of focusing on reforming our entitlement programs, we've largely cut our investments. We've cut our infrastructure, our education. That's the best way to invest in the future on the spending side of the budget, and we've been cutting it. So we've been doing the wrong types of deficit reduction, and it's been anti-growth. We also have not been hitting the drivers of the debt. I'll get into this more later, but the 3 fastest growing programs are Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. We've barely touched any of the 3. The $4 trillion of deficit reduction, almost none of that has come from any of the 3 fastest growing programs. And finally, this one is more my opinion, but a fact, but we've been cutting the types of spending that we as Americans should value the most. Most of these spending cuts have come from low-income programs and from programs for the young and for future generations. We've cut low-income housing, we've cut education, we've cut spending on investments, we've cut R&D. We restored some of that recently, but these aren't the areas of the budget we should be focusing on. So that's bad news, I guess, number 2 overall. The third piece of bad news is our debt problems actually are still not solved. In fact, they're very far from solved. We do have this 5-year lull where things appear pretty stable, but then they're just going to start rising again. We've done some projections that suggest that by 2018 or 2019, debt's going to go back on the unsustainable path that it was on before. Sometime in the 2030s, our total debt is going to exceed the size of our entire economy. Then it's going to continue to rise to 2 times the size of our economy in the 2060s, 3 times in the 2080s. These levels have never been seen anywhere. They're clearly unsustainable. They won't happen, but it matters how they don't happen, and we need to prevent them. Even if you don't worry about the debt itself, we have some programmatic problems that we face. In 2016, which is only a couple years from now, the Social Security Disability Program, its trust fund runs out of money. At that point, either everyone in the disability program gets a 20% cut, or we have to find some way to take money from somewhere else. Only a few years later, in the early 2020s, the Medicare trust fund runs out. And then in 2030, 33 or 31, depending on whose estimates you believe, the Social Security program on a unified basis runs out of money. What that means is every single beneficiary collecting Social Security in 2023 will see their benefits cut immediately by a quarter. Doesn't matter if you're high income, low income, if you're 62 years old, if you're 85 years old, everyone will receive that cut if we don't do something. And the reason we haven't solved our long-term problem is we haven't addressed the drivers. Now, in the short term, what's caused our debt to rise is largely the economic crisis, assisted by some unpaid-for tax cuts, some very expensive wars, and I think some irresponsible spending decisions by Congress. But in the long run, the real drivers of our debt are continued growing healthcare costs. Healthcare costs are continuing to grow in all areas of the economy, and an aging of the population. As we get older and as healthcare costs grow, we're spending more and more money on Social Security benefits, on Medicare benefits, and on Medicaid benefits. And we're getting less revenue because there's less workers paying in relative to that. We haven't solved that fundamental problem, and therefore all we've done is buy ourselves time. These high and growing levels of debt will have real consequences. For one, debt crowds out investment. When people are buying government bonds, they're buying that instead of buying productive private investment. And what that means is slower economic growth and slower wage growth. That's not something that you see in any given year. It's something that accumulates over time. So 40, 50 years from now, wages are only 2/3 of what they could have been, and we don't know why. Secondly, debt increase interest rates. That means, now right now interest rates are very low because the Federal Reserve is keeping them low, and we're still recovering from the economic crisis. And as Rudy Penner, former director of CB, always says, we're still the finest looking horse in the glue factory. So our interest rates are still okay, but they're going to start rising if we continue to borrow. And that's going to have real consequences. It's going to make it more difficult to get a mortgage, more difficult to get a car loan, a small business loan. And it means that when folks do get those loans, their cost of living is going to be higher to service them. Thirdly, the interest the government pays is going to go up. Over time, as interest rates rise and our debt rises, it means more and more government resources will be going just to pay back debt, just to service the debt we already have, instead of being invested in national security, education, healthcare. We won't be able to spend any of our money on priorities because we'll be spending all of our money paying for things that we already did in the past. And then there's still a real threat of a fiscal crisis. I think that we've bought ourselves a lot of time, but eventually this check will come due, and it could come due in a very disruptive way. We could see something like the financial crisis that we saw recently, which resulted in extraordinarily high unemployment, which resulted in big depletions of retirement accounts, except for, unlike last time, the government won't be able to step in and spend a lot more money and increase extended unemployment benefits and cut a lot of taxes. They won't have the capacity. And the government may be too big to fail, but I don't know anyone big enough to bail out the US federal government. And lastly, these bills will come due one way or the other. So at the end of the day, whether it's by crisis or by leadership, we are going to raise taxes and or cut spending. If we wait to do it, it means all of that burden falls on future generations. And that's the real dilemma we face. We're spending more and more of our budget on one segment of society, on the elderly, and we're putting more and more of the bill to the next generation to pay later. We haven't found a way to deal with this dilemma, and until we do, we're going to be running in circles. Thank you.
First of all, let me thank David for the invitation, I think. Two things. One, when I've done some television, I've been told that the person that you asked to go first is the one you like the least. So I don't know whether there's a subliminal message here or not, but message communicated and received, if that is the case. The second thing is, between David and Marc, I have absolutely nothing to say. They've taken all of my thunder, and so I'll do the very best I can. In all seriousness, I am very thankful for this opportunity to share with you today. And I hope that something is said that can certainly bring enlightenment to our minds as we deal with this subject. I'm using a little modern technology here called a Galaxy, so hopefully it will not mess me up. And I turn my radio off so I won't get a phone call right in the middle of my presentation and mess everything up in my word choice. This is a difficult subject in many ways because it's an emotional one. Talking about our debt, talking about the future of our country, it's a pretty broad area, but let me suffice it to say that I am not going to today to attempt to be wonky with Marc Goldwein sitting in front of me. It would be laughable were it not so sad for me to attempt to do statistics and ratios. So I don't want to get laughed out of the room, so I'll leave that up to the experts. But you've heard some historical context. You've heard how we had some wars that were not paid for, that there were some tricks played called supplementals to the budget so that you could have wars paid for but not included in the deficit. Then eventually it was included in the deficit, and we saw just how expensive that really was. I really want to, I think, talk about more the mega narrative, the meta narrative of what's going on as it relates to our debt. When it comes to the national debt, as a person of faith, obviously it is a moral issue. And as a person of faith, as a Christian in particular, I'm quite concerned about what I see and hear from various segments about the debt, how we're dealing with entitlements, because clearly we are on an unsustainable path. The Christian and Hebrew scriptures are replete with references to finances and debt. And before going too much further, allow me to suggest that whenever discussing things of that nature, it's important to draw the proper conclusion. And I know we have a couple of theologians in the room, so I don't want to insult them as well. But it's important whenever you're going to, as some do in our society, throw scriptures around, you have to build a proper, what is called hermeneutical bridge. Hermeneutics is the science of biblical interpretation, and sadly, many Christians, unfortunately, build the bridge backwards, meaning they take their current context, then go back to Scripture, and look for justification for their position, which on the surface sounds good, but it is not exegesis, it's eisegesis. And for those who are theologically literate, this will be totally inside baseball. But the problem with eisegesis is that you wind up with not Heilsgeschichte, which is the proper term, but Bullsgeschichte. The proper hermeneutical bridge investigates the original context using certain approaches, whether it's historical, cultural, critical method, grammatical, historical exegesis, redaction, canonical criticism. You use those tools to discover the sources, the form, the culture, and even the editorial process that was brought to the text in the first place. Then you build a bridge to attempt to apply the scripture to address our time and context. This is one of the reasons why biblical literalists can sometimes run into problems with such a limited and narrow hermeneutical approach, in my view. While it doesn't sound very spiritual, the reality is those who rail against this approach to the scriptures do this unwittingly all the time. Two examples. Number one, in every authorized textus receptus text of the Bible, which is what the King James Version is based upon, when it talks about Moses, it talks about the Red Sea. But it was not the Red Sea. Every Bible, even the ones fundamentalists use, there's a little letter there, and the reference is Yam Sumph. Yam Sumph is Sea of Reeds. Well, why didn't they just write out Sea of Reeds rather than put Red Sea and put a little asterisk that nobody reads? Because nobody would buy that Bible. Because persons, unfortunately, understand more about Handel's Messiah than Isaiah's. They understand more about Charlton Heston being Moses than what the text actually says. Secondly, the scriptures say that women should never go into sanctuary with their heads uncovered. But guess what? Every Sunday, every time women go to worship, they do with their heads uncovered. Even very conservative women. Why is that? Because they automatically understand that there was a cultural context to that scripture that doesn't apply today. But then on the other hand, they'll hold on tenaciously to literal interpretations of other things. In this debate about our national debt, some, in my view, have carelessly thrown around scriptures to justify their position, suggesting that we must address overspending by limiting the funding on certain programs because of the impact on our financial system, because people say, after all, the Bible says a man should not eat if it does not work. While that sounds good to certain constituencies, the problem is it's taken totally out of its original context. The scripture was referencing those who gave up on their jobs in anticipation of the parousia, the second coming of Christ, and they became a burden to the community. It had nothing to do with whether the government should spend money on extending unemployment benefits or the SNAP program. But some unsuspecting, well-intentioned believers will hear this from a trusted messenger and believe that the scripture was written to apply just to those who depend on the social safety net. It's therefore not difficult, not a stretch for them to take an overall view that the social safety net perhaps is disposable income to save our debt. It leads me to a larger point. We need to have a conversation about our spending, which threatens to render our economy unstable, our children and grandchildren's futures limited, and our position in the world uncertain. No question about it. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid are all on unsustainable paths, as you have heard Marc so eloquently describe. But clearly, to echo the words of Sir Edmund Burke in his famous dictum about evil, all it takes for evil to exist is for good people to do nothing. If our country ultimately goes into ultimate decline, it will be because the good people, including people of faith, did nothing. So I think we can agree something must be done. But what that something is, who that affects, are the ultimate and critical questions. For the faith community, I believe our role is a policing role. Our job is to be above the cacophony, the juvenile partisan politics, and call our public servants to a debate worthy of a great nation. But what we don't need is conversation where we take easy pot shots at people least able to defend themselves. In the aforementioned reference to the Bible's plethoric references to debt and finances, clearly it suggests that it is preferred to be the lender and not the borrower. In short, it takes a rather dim view of being in debt. But once again, you have to be very careful how you build the hermeneutical bridge. If not, it will let you off at the wrong place. The Bible, as well as the Hebrew Scriptures, are well intended to influence us towards justice, mercy, and a sense of community. The Hebrew scriptures as well as the New Testament are abundantly clear that the poor, the widow, the orphan are to be treated justly and under no circumstances were to be taken advantage of. But the question for our time is it the role of volunteerism or the role of government to look after the poor, or some combination of the two? My view is that just the debate of the role of charity in addressing the safety net is not enough. The faith community needs to lead or continue to lead in that area. In our congregation, for instance, we feed the homeless every week. And last year, we gave away enough food to feed 20,000 mouths. We're a Red Cross agency. We're partners with Baptist Health. All of those things we do without a dime from the federal government. Yeah, we have a nonprofit, but what we believe is doing what's right rather than find out where the money is and then apply for it. What if the whole Christian community took the approach of alleviating the hurting poor? Wouldn't that have the aggregate impact that's helpful to our debate and to our bottom line as a nation? The proper role of government is a big debate for us. But how one sees the role of government is oftentimes culturally influenced. As a side, people should stop trying to get the African American community to wholesale reject interventionist and big government. It won't happen. Why? Because if it were not for interventionist government, for African Americans, slavery would have looked different. The right to vote would have been different. Civil rights laws would have been different. And parenthetically, the church was split in its moral voice. Some actually believed that slavery was right. So in this conversation about the proper size and role of government, we have to have it, but the tone of the conversation must change. And in my view, those of us with an allegiance to a higher authority should be leading this conversation and setting the tone and the pace of the conversation. The scriptures written thousands of years ago, upon which most folks of faith base their lives, share one thing in common. The culture was a shame and honor culture. Women, children, widows, the poor had no place in that culture. Even Jesus' own disciples got caught up in that, being a product of their day, and said when children came near, push the children away. But Jesus then, by other examples as well as this example I'm highlighting, rebuked those disciples and said, for such are these children likened unto the kingdom. It is extremely important to understand that like the disciples in Jesus' day, it's easy to conform to a dominant mindset of wealth and power and then begin to stratify, classify, and put people into categories predicated upon what they do or don't have. What's the end result? The evaluation of people from those who are to be cared for to those who are to be tolerated. As a Catholic bishop recently said to President Obama, the Bible does not say, inasmuch you've done it unto the middle class. It says, inasmuch you've done it unto the least of these. If we claim the mantle of faith, we have no option but deem important what God has made clear is important. And very recently, as it was mentioned, I believe in David's remarks, that there has been a concept or a phrase used called the circle of protection. And this is enumerated in Jim Wallace's latest book on God's side. And simply put, the idea expresses that economic and fiscal policy cannot peacefully coexist with a faith community if it woefully neglects the very ones the scriptures make clear are at the heart of God's message. In our effort to get our economic and fiscal house in order, we cannot protect wealthy corporations' tax breaks while exacting further demands from those who can afford it the least. That's moral. It must be noted that this is not a zero-sum issue. Massive deficits are moral issues. Leaving our children worse off than the preceding generation is indeed sinful. To continually kick this can down the road to our children and grandchildren is an insult to our posterity. But we in the religious community and the faith community have to take up this debate because really it transcends partisan politics. Both Democrats and Republicans are going to show resistance in readdressing any constituency from which they draw significant votes or financial support. It's difficult. it's extremely difficult for a politician who has the interest in political longevity to speak to and address topics that his pollster is saying every time you mention this, you're losing. The faith community has an opportunity to be a clarion voice, indeed a nonpartisan voice, to call our politics to a higher level of debate. We must resist being in the hip pocket of either party. But I wish I could say I'm optimistic, because sadly, I am not at this point. Too many of us in our formulaic conceptions of God and religion and faith rely on platitudinous, demagogic, and hyperbolic rhetoric from the fringes, as opposed to reason and seasoned wisdom from those who see faith as an instrument, not as a weapon. Should we, must we, reduce spending and raise revenue for the financial security of our nation and our children? By all means. But the faith community cannot be unwitting accomplice in the political hypocrisy. When a politician says that we need money for weapons programs that go into a warehouse that is sitting in a desert and then rail against the safety net, the community of faith must speak out. Conversely, when a politician says that we don't need those weapon systems, but cannot have a conversation about chain CPI, cannot have a conversation about means testing Medicare, the faith community must speak out. We must raise the level of debate and keep all of our politicians honest to the golden and true compass that is indeed these United States of America. Thank you very much.
Well, Reverend Newman said that the rule he had heard about panels is that the person that goes first is the one that's like the least. I don't know if that's a general rule, but in this panel, I think the rule is that he who follows Reverend Newman is like the least. My background, incidentally, I write a lot in economics, but I'm actually a philosopher by trade. And so I thought I would kind of take this approach. I wanted to take essentially a philosophical and moral analysis of this question and just sort of clarify it. So I don't have any solutions to suggest, but I think many times when we're talking about the moral implications of various policies, frequently the sort of moral questions are not all that complicated. What is complicated is how to balance competing goods, the prudential judgment by which we figure out policies that will actually help, and those sorts of things. And I think honestly this is one of these issues in which the sort of moral details, the ethical details, are not all that complicated. What's complicated is, one, what we do and how we actually do it in our particular political climate. So first question I think we'd ask, if we're going to talk about the debt, the national debt, is it immoral? Is it a moral outrage? Is it morally permissible? Is simply this really basic question that actually in Christian history and Western history generally was asked for about 1600 or 1700 years. And it's simply the question, is it just to borrow money, or is it just to lend money? Or is it just to lend money and charge interest? Most people, if you don't know the sort of history, you might be surprised to learn that Christians across the spectrum, as well as Buddhists and Muslims still to this day, thought it was intrinsically unjust to charge for a money loan. Now, why is that? I mean, it's a very complicated discussion, and some people think the Bible directly teaches that. I think if you sort of follow the debate, what you discover is that the understanding of the nature of money changed. So, you think about a sort of first century ancient Near Eastern context, and what money does. Many people, including many Christian intellectuals, had accepted an argument from Aristotle. Aristotle said money is intrinsically sterile. It's just a unit of exchange. And so if you charge money for a money loan, you're essentially charging someone for something that doesn't have any value. All right, so it's essentially fraud. You're getting them to think they've got getting something of value, and you're charging them for it, but they haven't. But notice that entire argument presupposes a certain understanding of money. This is why, at least in Christian theology, Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox, There's a changing assessment about money loans in the last few centuries. Well, how did that happen? Was it because they rejected the Bible or theology? No, in most cases it was because we came to understand money, at least money in modern economies, in a different way. So that if you're a lender in a sort of normal banking situation, you want to get a loan to buy a car or a business loan, right? We understand that in that context, money actually isn't sterile, it can be fertile. A business loan can actually create new wealth. Moreover, if you're borrowing money and the terms of the trade are clear, you're gaining something. You're getting something of value. In fact, if you sort of buy the subjective theory of economic value, the value of the thing is sort of determined by the person purchasing it. And so obviously if you're getting a loan, you perceive it as being of value. At the same time, the lender has to bear a cost. If I'm a bank and I give you a $100,000 loan, there's a time value to money, there's the opportunity cost I give up by giving you the loan, and then there's the risk that I incur by giving you the loan. And so this is why I think as a general question, it's important to understand the historical context of debt and lending. But I think actually in general, in sort of normal circumstances, it's just to borrow money and it's just to lend money at interest in general. So the second question is this, and Reverend Newman actually said this was immoral to indebt future generations, and I completely agree. But this is sort of philosophically in ethics, this is a kind of a complicated question. And we might just ask it this way: is it just to borrow money that someone not party to the transaction must repay? I think that's the basic question that we're after. And our moral intuitions, I suspect, whatever your sort of political views, probably converge on this question. We know there's something wrong about it. And you see it by actually thinking about what we talked about the justice of lending money and charging interest in the first place. If I'm an ordinary borrower and I'm getting a value for my loan, right, and the lender gives me the loan, part of our assessment of the justice of that act is that we know I'm the beneficiary of the loan. I also bear the cost of the loan, right? So there's an alignment between the costs and the benefits in the sort of free agency of the borrower. The problem with long-term debt is that that's not the case. It's actually possible to borrow money in such a way that you're the beneficiary of that borrowed money, but somebody else is bearing the cost. Now, there's actually a really obscure philosophical dispute here that it would not normally occur to rational people, and it's this. Do we have moral obligations to people that don't yet exist? This is actually a perennial difficulty because some people's intuitions are that, well, no, we have a moral obligation to people that already exist. What does it mean to have an obligation to someone that doesn't exist? It sounds like a sort of a strange thing to say when you first hear it. Now, we could spend a lot of time on this. My general view is that the moral intuition that it is wrong to harm people in our progeny is very widely shared. I have a picture on this slide of a book by James Hansen, who is more on the political left. He's concerned about climate change and thinks it's going to be catastrophic. And look at the name of the book. It's Storms of My Grandchildren, The Truth About Coming Climate Catastrophe and Our Last Chance to Save Humanity. What's the premise of the title, and obviously the argument of his book, is that it's immoral to do something now which we might get benefit from. Let's say that using hydrocarbons is going to create catastrophic climate change, and we're benefiting from that in the present, but future generations, our progeny and the progeny of others, will suffer as a consequence. And so it's a very widely held, if not universal, assumption outside sort of philosophy departments that we do have moral obligations to our progeny. And I think this is the good news, because I think most of us share this belief. Whether you're a Christian, if you're Jewish, non-religious, Democrat, Republican, we tend to share this belief. And I think that's why this is one of these few issues on which there's a lot of bipartisan agreement. The disagreement is when it comes to what should we do. Well, the question that especially though we're dealing with when we're talking about the debt is even a slightly more precise question, and this is how I've framed it. Is it just to confiscate the legally earned wealth of one citizen to give it to another? Now, I'm not talking about welfare and means-tested programs here. I'm wanting you to see that what we're talking about very specifically is it just for a third party to extract a cost and make another third party bear the cost, and then they bear the cost, and then through the transaction of the agent, in this case the government, give someone else the benefit. Right? That's actually what we're dealing with. Now, insofar as we're a representative republic, the citizenry, of course, bears responsibility for the decisions of politicians. But the truth of the matter is this is a bipartisan disaster because we're essentially acquiescing to the act in which we sort of delegate the authority to the state to confiscate wealth from future generations for our benefit. Right? And that has huge consequences. And these are, I think, moral consequences quite apart from the question of the unsustainability of the debt, which of course deals with the possibility that we destroy our civilization by destroying the currency. That's a problem on its own. I'm just talking about this basic question of doing something that you benefit and someone outside the transaction bears the cost. We deal with this in environmental issues all the time. In environmental policy, it's called an externality. So an externality would be, let's say I got a lumber company and I want to get wood from a sawmill, and so we make a deal, and it's a free exchange. It's a win-win on both sides, and so the sawmill gives me the lumber, I get the lumber, and I sell it at a profit. But in the meantime, the sawmill is dumping a bunch of toxic sludge in the river, and you don't live nearby, and so that doesn't bother you. But there's a town just downriver that actually bears the cost. That's called an externality. Somebody else is bearing the cost that's not a party to the transaction. I think essentially what we're dealing with the national debt is an externality, and it's just the cost and benefit, rather than being two current people, is generally the benefit is in the present, the cost is for someone else in the future. I may be mistaken, but this doesn't seem like an especially morally complicated issue. I think there's something deeply troubling about this. I think we all sort of know that. And the reason I've taken what might to some of you seem like a pedantic approach is just to try to sort of clear away our concerns, our political and policy concerns, and just focus on this narrow question of the justice of an act. Justice generally has to do with giving each his or her due. So two people are equal, they're treated as equal, or their acts are equal, they're treated as equal. If they're unequal, you treat them in this sort of appropriate, unequal way in this context. That's the basic idea of justice. And we're not doing that if we're enjoying the benefits of something that someone else will repay. So I actually think this is not all that complicated of an issue. And I think that the conclusion in many ways sort of suggests itself. It's not rocket science here. This is not a really complicated moral question having to do, for instance, with the justice of a particular war in which you have all sorts of complicated competing goods. The only exception that I can think of to this assessment, in which there's an injustice because we're enjoying the benefits and our progeny bear the cost, would be in a situation in which genocide or cultural destruction is the issue. Right? If you're literally, let's imagine that a country is embroiled in a war with a genocidal enemy who's likely to succeed unless that government is able to borrow money in order to fight the war. I think the argument could be made that that's a just use, because why is that? Why would it be just for the government in a society in that context to borrow money, even that future generations might repay? Well, it's because, right, the future generations in that case are also beneficiaries of the act. If a culture is utterly destroyed, it doesn't have any progeny. And so I think on the extreme, there's an exception to this, but it's not really an exception, it's just an elaboration of the point, that if in some way a current expenditure truly and legitimately sort of shares its benefits both to the present generation and to the future, then a case could be made. But remember, even there, except in the extreme, there's a problem with the transaction, because what we're doing is we're making the decision for the benefits of someone else, our assessment of what's beneficial to future generations. And so there's still a kind of imbalance in the act. But I think in that one circumstance, a case could be made for incurring debt that somebody else will repay. But in general, this just ain't rocket science. It's unjust. Thank you very much.
Well, we've now heard a powerful sermon, and we've heard a philosophical, tight argument, and that's a tough act to follow as well. And the only way I know how to do that is by starting out with a story. A story is told of a man who's walking along a beach, and he manages to sort of stub his toe on something, and he looks down, and wouldn't you know, it's a purple bottle. And so he pulls out the cap of that purple bottle, and a genie pops out. And the man's rather stunned by the whole thing, and the genie says, well, here I am. I'm ready to grant you any one wish. The man says, well, that's easy. I want to live forever. The genie says, oh, I'm so sorry. That is the one and only wish I cannot grant. So the man stops for a second, scratches his head. He thinks, he says, well, very well. I'd like to live long enough to see the United States Congress balance its budget and pay off the federal deficit. The genie looks at him and says, you clever bastard. Thanks very much to David and to Marc for convening this session. It's a pleasure to get to be representing AEI's Values and Capitalism project that does a lot of work with evangelical college students around the country. I want to talk a little bit from sort of that framework about a couple of themes. So evangelicals historically have in the last century really wrestled with fundamentalism and with sort of stressing the afterlife, especially against the rise of higher criticism. But a lot of that has changed in recent decades, in more recent decades. Less about Gnosticism and the spiritual maximization, absolutization of things, and more about engaging directly with the problems and affairs of this world. And as Reverend Newman said, Christians in the United States have a long history of being deeply engaged in social and political and cultural issues. Civil rights movement is a wonderful example, of course. And being the power behind what eventually downstream becomes political change as well. We certainly hope that will be the case with this looming critically important issue. So financial stewardship is part of stewardship, says Ron Blue and David Ramsey, who have both made waves in the evangelical world. Why is that the case? Well, that's because creation norms are part of life. They're built into things. They're part of the fabric of the universe. So the debtor, it's been mentioned, is going to be servant to the lender. Proverbs 22:7. Orphans and widows, Paul says, James says in the epistle, deserve a different kind of support than able-bodied individuals. And in love, Paul says that an able-bodied man who rejects available work should not eat, with the context you've heard before from Reverend Newman. The yoke of slavery, the yoke of debt is real. And we know this because we experience it, because the scriptures say it and because we experience it. If you borrow money from your brother-in-law and you see him at a holiday party, the relationship is affected. The yoke of debt is real. So how are Christians, and especially evangelical Christians, learning? Well, David Ramsey has been a popular manual and curriculum in a lot of churches in recent years, and he has an image that some of you may recognize from the Proverbs. Proverbs 6, 4, and 5 says that, "Give no sleep to your eyes, nor slumber to your eyelids. Deliver yourself like a gazelle from the hand of the hunter, and like a bird from the hand of the fowler." Like a gazelle, he makes a lot of that phrase. And in fact, he has an image of a cheetah chasing after a gazelle that lasts about 60 seconds. And you can imagine it. It's a warring chase, and the gazelle makes it. Like a gazelle, we ought to flee debt. Ramsey pushes this point. He says we ought to approach it systematically. We ought to get a little debt snowball going, pay off one debt, then pay off the next bigger debt, then pay off the really big debt. Debt. Christian college students and college students in general today graduate with an average of how much debt? Any guesses? $26,500. An average of $26,500. In that economy, that's trouble. And this economy, that's clearly trouble. So what to do? Well, our colleague at AEI, Charles Murray, says in each of these cases, you ought to stare unblinkingly at the problem. You need to look hard at the facts and look directly at the problem without blinking. So what are the facts? Well, there's a little handout outside that some of you may have picked up. I see some of you have, from Nick Eberstadt, who wrote a wonderful little book called A Nation of Takers, America's Entitlement Epidemic. We have a couple of copies here. And in that book, Eberstadt says a number of things that I think scream that deserve hearing in this conversation. A couple of them. In 1983, fewer than 30% of households received one or more government benefits. By 2011, this number had skyrocketed to 49%, a 19% jump in 3 decades. From 1940 to 1960, entitlement transfers accounted for under 1/3 of federal spending. Today, over 2/3 of federal spending goes to entitlements. Over 2/3 of federal spending goes to entitlements. That's before you paid for police, justice, roads, defense. A transfer of $2.2 trillion. That's 3 times as much as all military and defense spending in the same year of 2010. As you know, 1 in 6 Americans today is on food stamps, more than 1 in 4 children. This is a problem. This is one side of the coin. So it's easy, of course, to talk about debt in terms of dollars and cents, in terms of pragmatic realities. And that's mostly what we do here in Washington. Today's conversation is different in the sense that we're talking about the moral dynamics of the problem. And that's critical on a host of fronts. One reason is that's so critical is because this reality will impact the poor. We know that. How do we know that? Well, we know that because if you look at Spain, if you look at Greece, ultimately, a looming debt will lead to austerity measures. And when austerity measures hit, they will not hit people in this room. When austerity measures hit, they will hit the poor the hardest. And we know that to be a fact from history, and we ought to think ahead about that reality. When austerity measures hit, they will hit the poor the hardest. So if we care about the poor, we need to get in front of this issue. Of course, it's not just the poor. It's also people on the outskirts of Washington, D.C.'s Beltway. We know from Time magazine 2 years ago, a piece said that 6 in 10 of the wealthiest counties in the country were right here in Washington, contractors. This year, the Washington Post just published a piece, and 7 in 10 of the wealthiest counties in the country are on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. That is not right. Right? We know that there's crony statism at work. That is not right. It can't sustain, and ultimately, it leads to learned helplessness, not only for those who get entangled in the safety net and remain there, but for those who become dependent on government contracts year after year after year and continue to enlarge their share of this unending federal pie. So what to do? Well, Jesus' parables and the whole counsel of Scripture talk about not proof texting. We think about not proof texting so much, but ultimately the reality that idolatry is at the heart of this problem. You know, it's so tempting here to think in terms of a policy solution to this problem. And maybe a problem, sort of a solution set here in Washington, D.C., a well-intended initiative is a dream of being helpful. Obviously, that can easily, and we've seen it happen in the last 3, 4, 5 decades, that can easily lead to unintended consequences. And so we need to be careful, it seems to me, about centrally planned solutions that originate here to fix this problem. Better, more modest, more humble, is to honor the principle of subsidiarity and to push solutions out to more local levels where people who are relationally connected to the poor, people who are relationally connected to others can lead the way. Reverend Newman talked about this a little bit. Jay talked about this a little bit. There is also an intergenerational dynamic at work in this problem. We talked about student debt, but and I think Jay's covered this point long enough to leave it to the discussion. But that intergenerational dynamic is something that I think our generation, and we have some bloggers at valuesandcapitalism.com, and I know IFWE does, and IRD does, and others do as well, who are waking up to this reality and who have a voice in terms of what is happening to them for the future that deserves a hearing. A group called Christians for a Sustainable Economy asked the question, whom would Jesus indebt? And I know Marc was a leader in that work a couple of years ago, so he may talk about that a little bit as well. I would say, in the context of working with Christian colleges, that a number of our schools are finding the need to get ahead of this problem, and for obvious reasons. The board steps in sometimes, as it did a few months ago in Cedarville University in Ohio, to say, look, bottom line isn't being met. Tuition needs tweaking, needs adjusting. And the president who's come in has balanced the ship, right. And there is new freedom for the professors with whom we work. There is new freedom for the school to look ahead to a long and prosperous future. So should we despair? Well, absolutely not. There is every reason for optimism and hope. We just have to get ahead of the problem. And we have to do something that is hard. We have to do something that requires leadership, presidential leadership, congregational leadership, local level leadership. We have to be called to do something that is squarely, I believe anyway, at the heart of the Christian gospel. We have to sacrifice. If we're called to sacrifice, if we're led well, we can make it. Thanks very much to the committee for convening this conversation. Look forward to discussion. Clearly, it is time to get to work.
Well, it's an honor to be here with you all, and according to Reverend Newman, I must be, as the last speaker, the best-loved speaker, so I'll relish that role and see how long that lasts. I'm going to share a bunch of quotes with you about the religious and church debate over debt, so I hope you'll indulge me, but I think they're revealing quotes and worth sharing. As several of you have already referenced, in April of 2011, fretting that the impending 2012 budget might restrain the growth of favorite federal programs, a number of major church groups joined together to form a quote-unquote circle of protection to fight what they term budget cuts to essential social services and entitlement programs. That coalition of religious groups included, for example, Jim Wallace's Sojourners, top officers of a number of old-line Protestant denominations, the Episcopal Church, the United Church of Christ, the Presbyterian Church USA, the United Methodist Church, among others. The National Council of Churches was a part of it. Some evangelical groups, such as the National Association of Evangelicals and a number of its member denominations, such as the Evangelical Covenant Church and the Church of the Nazarene and the Salvation Army, plus also the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops here in Washington was a member as well. And this circle of protection was announced to coincide in April of that year with Lent and Holy Week, with some circle leaders like Jim Wallace urging that church people publicly fast against federal budget cuts as they participate in Lent and in Holy Week. They announced their initiative in a media conference call that week, and at the time my organization noted that many of these same religious groups had joined forces in the past to oppose reforms in federal spending, most notably against the relatively successful 1996 welfare reform law, which they incorrectly prophesied would doom America's poor. That campaign, too, had incorporated a Holy Week protest that appropriated liturgical elements relating to Christ's crucifixion. In our own news release response to the Circle of Protection back in 2011, we said, the faith that unites these groups seems to be in perpetually expanding federal government. That this false idol will deliver endless debt and reduced economic opportunity without helping the poor does not seem to distress these self-proclaimed so-called prophetic voices. And our news release went on, claiming that children are perilously endangered by even modest restrictions on federal growth, these officials seem unconcerned about the mountains of debt and potential crushing taxation passed along to these very same children at some point in the future. Well, later in 2011, in July of that year, the president met for 40 minutes at the White House with the Circle of Protection and about a dozen church leaders who were participants in it. Of course, the church leaders in that meeting emphasized their concern for, quote unquote, the least of these, of course, a phrase going back to Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew to describe the poor and the vulnerable. And the circle in that meeting professed to be speaking for a majority of American church members, and numerically on paper, that was factual. Well, in response, a bunch of us, including several of us here in this room, formed a Christians for a Sustainable Economy to reject the Circle of Protection's claims and to offer a very different vision, emphasizing that uncontrolled federal debt is itself a moral crisis demanding the urgent attention of concerned Christians and all people of faith. We urged the president and congressional leaders to, quoting our statement, consider the whole counsel of Scripture, which urges not only compassion and provision for the poor, but also the perils of debt and the importance of wise stewardship. And we said, to the question, what would Jesus cut, posed by the circle of protection, we add the question, whom would Jesus indebt? And we noted that the Good Samaritan in the Bible did not use a government credit card. Well, our letter responding to the circle of protection back in 2011 faulted them for claiming that, quote, biblical mandates preclude limits to federal programs for low-income people. And we warned that whatever their good intentions, the consequence of the circle of protection argument is to, quote, provide a religious imprimatur for big government and to sanctify federal welfare programs that are often ineffective, even counterproductive, hurting the people they're supposed to be helping. Rather than protecting programs for the poor, we said, quote, we need to protect the poor themselves. And we pointed out that sometimes programs that ostensibly serve the poor, quote, actually demean the poor, undermine their family structures, and trap them in poverty, dependency, and despair for generations. And we concluded such programs are unwise, uncompassionate, and unjust. We went on to say that raising the debt ceiling may have solved an immediate problem at that time of federal cash flow, but did not seriously address the larger challenge of reducing the national debt, which of course was true. And we said, we believe the poor of this generation and generations to come are best served by policies that promote economic freedom and growth, that encourage productivity and creativity in every able person, and that wisely steward our common resources for generations to come. All Americans, especially the poor, are best served by sustainable economic policies for a free and flourishing society. When creativity and entrepreneurship are rewarded, the yield is an increase of productivity and generosity across society. We warn that Matthew 25, the phrase I referenced earlier, and other admirable commands to Christian charity cannot be effectively implemented through federally orchestrated wealth redistribution. We affirm the need for an underlying social safety net, but suggested what is really needed is robust economic growth, job production, and accompanying debt reduction. And we said, just as we should not balance the budget on the backs of the poor, quoting the circle, we should not balance the budget on the backs of our children and grandchildren. We suggested that the circle of protection did not fully represent the large and diverse community of Christian faith, and we asked this question: were the professed constituencies of these groups polled on budget matters? Once again, this political campaign appears to be a top-down effort engineered by denominational elites who did not bother to check with their own people in the pews before they spoke politically. Well, more recently, this fall, just a few months ago, the Circle of Protection, at least momentarily resurrected to challenge what it derided as, quote-unquote, cutting $40 billion from the food stamp program. And typically unmentioned by the church officials and the Circle was that these so-called cuts were reductions in proposed increases over the next 10 years in a program that cost annually $80 billion. Also unmentioned was that food stamp recipients had increased by 70% over the previous 5 years, with now 47 million Americans, or about 15% of our country, now receiving food stamps. And these so-called cuts reportedly reduce food stamp spending to only about 2010 levels. Still, the churchly rhetoric against the so-called cuts was very heated. Quote, these immoral cuts are incongruent with the shared values of our nation, insisted Jim Wallace of Sojourners, who called them severe. And he added, they demonstrate the triumph of political ideology and self-interest over sound public policy and concern for the general welfare. But responding to Wallace and to the Circle of Protection, I would suggest that church pronouncements that equate nearly any potential limits on social welfare or entitlement spending with cruel so-called self-interest themselves ignore the wider general welfare. Historically, all of the major Christian traditions have emphasized thrift, self-denial, personal and societal fiscal probity, and sacrifice on behalf of future generations. From early in the 20th century, much of then mainline Protestantism, under the social gospel's influence, portrayed the federal government as the primary guarantor of the common good through redistribution and entitlements without specific regard for fiscal responsibility or the impact of unsustainable spending on everyone in society. Many Catholics in the 20th century also reinterpreted Catholic social teaching along similar lines. Much more recently, even some evangelical elites have joined in this understanding. Consequently, much of organized Christianity now focuses on protecting the federal welfare entitlement state without serious attention to debt, although implying debt can be addressed exclusively through tax increases and military cuts, which of course is not realistic. Churches whose representatives think this way need to remember Christianity's traditional understanding of the state's vocation for order and the common good, not merely as a smorgasbord of unending entitlement checks. The economic and social health of every nation requires limits on government spending and avoidance of unsustainable debt, especially to leave space for civil society, above all the church, plus private charities, philanthropies, private business, and so on. Faith in unlimited government as guarantor of all material benefits is ultimately, to use a word others have used today, idolatrous from nearly any historic faith perspective. Historically, churches in America taught thrift, restraint, and probity. Now, too many of them, at least their elites or their spokespeople, are aligned with entitlement thinking and have transferred onto the state expansive philanthropic duties that should more properly be centered on individuals, families, and churches, a perspective that simultaneously undermines all these institutions if carried through. As a corrective to recent church trends, there needs to be a rediscovery of classical Christian teaching about the transcendent responsibility to future generations that mandates fiscal responsibility in our own time. This teaching should emphasize that such fiscal responsibility benefits not only those future generations, but is spiritually edifying also for us in this day and is key to human happiness in every time and in every place. Thank you.
That was extraordinarily interesting. Wasn't that just to hear the different perspectives on this? There's a lot of fiscal discussions in D.C., but I submit that few as interesting as this because it takes such an interesting and helpful angle on some of these questions. There's so many theological points that are going in my mind that if my voice were in a different condition, I would ask about. I think everything from the stewardship of creation that God has given us to the Garden of Eden story and what we learn about limits and personal responsibility and the need to recognize that things are finite and that we have to take responsibility for them, to the areas of compassion that we have heard of today. So, but given the opportunity that we have to hear from our speakers here and the opportunity that you have perhaps to have formulated some questions in your minds, let's open it up now in the interest of time, and we'll start with these two gentlemen right here as their questions have gone. We'll just take two questions. We'll go in pairs of two questions, and we'll just see where the discussions lead us. All right? So go ahead, sir. If you would identify yourself and ask a single question, and then we'll just see where the discussion goes and who's appropriate to answer them. Go ahead, sir.
My name is Howard Rosen. I'm an economist. I do work on the ethical dimensions of globalization. I'm very troubled by this discussion, and I think the reason, Reverend Newman, that you were put first was there was a hope that maybe people would listen to you before they put forward their own preconceived notions. Several of the speakers talked as if they had an implication that they knew the right size of government. I don't know what that has to do with morality. Governments didn't even exist at the time that ethics and moralities were being discussed, so I don't think that morality has that number in place. So the question is not what does morality have to say about these things, but who's the arbiter out there? Who's going to stand up and after we listen to people who say these kinds of things that do exactly what you said not to do, which is use text to support their ideology, who gets up and says that's a bastardization of religion and morality?
All right. That's a perspective. We'll take the question in the front here. We'll take a second question for the gentleman in the front here.
Thank you all. Tyler O'Neill with the Christian Post.
Yeah.
My question is, two of you, I believe Josh Good and Marc Tooley, both mentioned the idolatry of trusting in the federal government benefits as the sort of fix-all, solve-all solution to poverty. And I'd like to hear whether the other panelists agree.
Interesting. All right. Any reaction? Anyone want to take our... Jay, you want to
Just
start?
very briefly, the first question, I won't speak for everyone else, but nothing I said implied anything about the legitimate size of government. It was simply whatever size of government we decide as a community we want, we should bear the costs of that, assuming that there's some benefit to the size that we choose. I think it's a legitimate question, but it's a different question to say, okay, is there a kind of intrinsically proper size of government? My own view is that it depends on way too many factors to give a simple answer, except if I had to, I would say we want a government strong enough to enforce the rule of law and the common good, but not so large and unlimited that it becomes a violator of the common good and the rule of law. But at least with respect to the debt, you could have a small government that has unsustainable debt as well. And I think if you're enjoying a benefit and you're forcing someone else to pay the cost, that's the central moral dilemma that I think is involved in the debt.
Yeah, John.
Yeah, I think also that to address the first question of who's the arbiter, I believe that the community of faith has an opportunity to be the arbiter. But I think unfortunately what happens is that the faith community is so fractured in and of itself that I think what we're called to do is not to subscribe to a particular socio-theological paradigm that suggests that big government is bad or that limited government is good. We've got to find the right size of government. You know, what's the most effective size of government? And there is a tendency in the faith community to take your own socioeconomical posture and status and bring that to the scriptures. It's easy to say that this or that should or shouldn't be within the context of government, and then turn around and say, well, government is ordained of God in Romans 13. So you have to bring a sense of balance to the conversation, which is one of the things I was trying to say, that we have to be above the fray. And in too many instances, on the left, the progressives seem to be solely in the hip pocket of the Democratic Party, and conservatives on the right seem to be solely in the hip pocket of the Republican parties, when God is not even an American. I know that's a shock to many people in the room. And there's no American flag waving by the throne of grace. He transcends that. And we have to be transcendent in our postures and make sure that we're always challenging and examining our positions to make sure that, to borrow actually Abraham Lincoln's phrase, that God's not on our side, but that we're on his side.
Anyone want to address the second question at all here?
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, the idea that it is idolatry to trust in government programs as as like the only or primary solution to poverty. Perhaps you could apply the same to defense, but it seemed mostly in the context of economic solutions that it was mentioned.
Yeah, that's an interesting. The role of idolatry is a pretty interesting one in terms. I mean, part of what's passionate about these questions is when you combine morality and finance, you get strong issues that come up, and idolatry is one. Anyone want to touch it?
Well, I don't want to dominate conversation, but very quickly, I think idolatry is, etymologically, it is putting something before God, and that can manifest in a plethoric number of ways. And so I think across the board, it's important that we don't become idolatrous. But I think we always, though, have to maintain that as people of faith, we have a transcendent position, that we are not limited. For instance, it was legal to tell me I can't eat at Woolworths. It was legal to tell me I couldn't check into Holiday Inn. It was legal, but it wasn't moral. And so those of us who have a transcendent theology, a transcendent paradigm personally, can call the state into question when we believe they have violated the laws of God. But it gets cloudy because, how do you interpret that? And who interprets that? And where are they coming from? And we all bring that to the table. I mean, let's be honest. We bring all that stuff to the table. So it's difficult. Yeah, to discern.
If my health doesn't improve, and I won't preach on Sunday, I'm coming to listen to you on Sunday night. I'm just going to come on down to Florida. All right, what other questions do we have here? Do we have, yes, sir.
Well, we know, Dan Lieberman, I'm a writer. We know the government has debt, but who is really responsible for the government debt? The country runs on debt, and in the 2008 crisis, we had reached a peak in credit, so the government had to step in, or else there would have been a free fall in the economy. And even now, we talk about government debt crowding out private credit, but we note that the banks have plenty of money. Federal Reserve has pumped the economy with money, and yet the banks are not lending. So the government still has to support the credit that is needed to drive the economy. We also have a tremendous deficit in the balance of payments, and the government has to support that deficit in the balance of payments. And we also have private industry not hiring, and the government has to then support. So aren't we looking at this thing in slightly a wrong way? Shouldn't we be looking at not what the government can do to reduce the debt, but what private industry can do so the government reduces the debt?
Interesting. Marc or Jay, or anyone want to? The role of the private sector in some of this.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, in general, think about the late 1990s, and we had the tech boom and finally had a surplus for a few years. So obviously, government revenues can be determined largely by what happens in the private sector. But, Monsanto, for all their problems, is not the one deciding the size of the government debt. I would argue it's primarily those who are making the decisions. It's not somebody else. And so politicians, and then those of us as Americans, also bear the responsibility because we don't live in a dictatorship. And so if we reward politicians that do this and punish politicians that try to do something about it, we clearly bear some of the responsibility as well.
Marc, do you want to?
I'll just add a quick piece. We don't elect corporations at the ballot box. Where the public has the greatest, most direct influence is over the government. And of course, the government is not the sole decider or sole arbiter of what the economy looks like. And of course, there are many private reforms, and the government public policy can address them in a number of ways, including regulations, including spending, including taxes. But government is the one that's most directly accountable to the people. And so that's where the focus of public policy, I think, should be first.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's see any other questions. So, lady here. So, yeah, now all sorts of, they're all responding. Marc, you've enticed them. I 6 hands just go up. So, I'll take 2 questions here. Here, and I saw the second one in the back there. Yeah. No, the lady right here. I'm sorry. And then the first 2 hands that I happen to see. So, the lady here and then the gentleman in the back.
Hi, my name's Jane Ansel. I work at the British Embassy. I just had a question about whether you thought there was a difference in the moral case depending on the type of spending. Something that struck me that perhaps spending on investment, so bridges that might last for a few generations, or R&D that might benefit future generations, even educating teachers that might teach our children or our grandchildren, could be, there's an argument that maybe some of the cost of that could be pushed to the future, and whether that's a case for more investment spending in the US, and that's something true in the UK as well that we're interested in.
Well, I would just say briefly that I think in principle that's right. I mean, it's a prudential question whether you're weighing the costs and the benefits right, but I argued that if, let's say we're the borrower, we're a beneficiary, but the people that are paying it back primarily are not us but someone else, but they're also beneficiaries, that would be a principle by which we could balance those things. I think it's just that only in a few cases, I think, is it really obvious. If we don't spend this money, we don't borrow this money, we all die and there's no future generation. It's very unambiguous there. A bridge, it's just kind of more complicated.
Say here, take 2 questions here. I think, does the gentleman have a question? Do you have a question? Yeah, I see. And then the gentleman in the back there. Let's go on this side, then we'll go to the other side.
My name is Ed Brigham. I'm retired federal executive, and all my 34-year career was budget related. I think the panelists have done a terrific job of laying out the debate, the stalemate, if you will, about how you reduce the debt. I think there's a closely related question that I think has as many ethical implications, and that's how fast should we be reducing the debt. I think Marc Goldwein came closest to getting to that issue, but what do ethics and theology give us to helping decide that question?
Okay, let's pair. Well, the panelists are thinking about responses to that. The gentleman in the back.
Tyler Bond. I'm with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. In several of your comments, you seem to suggest that the main thing we should do to reduce the debt is to cut government spending. Particularly, several of you implied that we spend too much on safety net programs and other programs like Social Security and Medicare. Given Jesus' frequent denunciations of wealth throughout the gospel, do you also think we should close tax expenditures that primarily benefit the wealthy, which many economists also regard as a form of spending through the tax code?
All right, so we have the pace of reduction and we have tax expenditures. And the ethical merit. Anyone want to address either of those two?
Well, I tend to think that economic growth is probably the long-term solution to this fundamental conversation, and that it is theologically anyway, in terms of faith informing the dialogue, it's unhelpful that aspects of our safety net playing out the way they do sort of disqualify accidentally certain populations, communities, from being a part of tax-paying American citizens and citizens who experience the gift of the free enterprise system. It's not right. My wife is here, so she could tell you about all my idolatries to the earlier question. We all struggle with these things day by day, but it's not right when, as was our experience, we have neighbors who, single mom in this case, who we came to know and love over 3 years, who had 8 children. And, 3 of her daughters had children of her own and were drawn into the system in ways that were unhealthy. We've got to look at the human cost to the entanglement of the net that sometimes plays out. The longer-term solution, speed, just ask my AEI colleagues.
What about the reduction, the pacing question as well? Marc, were you
Well, yeah, so I think there's actually 3 good questions here in a row. If we're spending on investments for future generation, is it okay to borrow from the future generation? Given the state of the economy, how fast should we sort of move from big deficits to small deficits? And are we over-focusing on low income as opposed to high income related programs and tax preferences? On all 3, I think that we've just done this wrong, unfortunately. We've made a lot of progress in the amount of deficit reduction we've done, but our timing has been wrong. You need some at the, sort of upfront to give yourself credibility, but we've had some unnecessarily deep austerity in years 1, 2, and 3, when the real problem is in years 5, 6, 7, 10, 20, 15. We focus too much on the discretionary budget, which is sort of just abstract numbers, and that's where all the low-income programs are, or most of them, and not enough on the entitlements. And we haven't done anything to close a single loophole in the tax code. And the tax code's a mess. We can make it more efficient, more pro-growth. We can actually lower rates and still have a more progressive tax code that more fairly taxes folks that actually owe the money.
All right, let's move to this side of the equation. So I saw the gentleman in the back. We'll just go there and move forward here as we start moving our time.
Yeah, I want to build on Josh Good's comments. I also live amongst the working poor, and I have a neighbor. Excuse me. I have a neighbor who has a 2-bedroom house or a condo with 3 flat screen TVs and has subsidized everything. I have another neighbor who wanted to get a job, got a job, found her housing assistance and insurance for her family reduced because she got a job, so she quit the job. So you have programs that actually disincentivize people to break free from from the system, and I don't see any biblical or justice in seeing people incentivized towards weakness. Particularly I'm curious about Pastor Newman's perspective on that issue as well.
All right, let's get another question before we answer, and John, you can take it. And so let's go on the far right, and then we'll move forward this way.
I guess just to maybe broaden it a little, I like the idea of this debt being an externality. And I think it's clear from the timing issues that we're not quite sure how quickly to reduce the debt. We're not quite sure what happens negatively at what point along the road. But we are certain of a few things. We're certain of when taxes are taken out of our paychecks, and we are certain of the programs that we have for the poor, for the unemployed, and the direct effect that has, and I believe a positive effect. So if the externality is a little bit uncertain, isn't the moral question closer to, is it more moral to spend our resources to help the poor or have whatever social safety net we have, or is it more moral to make sure we're not confiscating people's earnings? And once you answer those two questions, I think the debt externality takes care of itself more, right?
Yeah, so then your point would be that we have a moral obligation both to our the people that are here now as well as to people that will come after us. I think it's exactly right. I mean, most sort of public policy discussions, especially with respect to that, deal with both of those. I do think, just to sort of chime in on what Marc said, that the entitlement problem is the real kicker. And what's frustrating about the entitlement problem is that it surfaces the fact that it's not like we don't know what we would need to do, but the political incentives, I honestly think, are almost impossible, because I'm simplifying, but take something like Medicare and Social Security. If we just started raising the minimum age for receiving that by 6 months every year, no one would ever get on the program and then get kicked off, but those of us farther from retirement would just have a little longer to wait. That's not that complicated, but it's politically costly because the problem is in the out years, and it's always farther out than, say, a 2-year election cycle or something like that. So I actually don't think with entitlement reform it's all that complicated. I just can't see a way that, unless the American citizenry becomes generally educated and concerned, that politicians will ever have an incentive to do anything.
Well, that's really what's key. The citizenry becoming educated and concerned. Let me go back to the question the gentleman asked in the back row. Any system that enslaves people cannot be biblically or theologically justified. Here's the thing I would say as a caveat, however, is that the overwhelming number of people who are getting assistance are not in that category. The overwhelming number of people who are getting help are not gaming the system. The impression is that they are, because it's highlighted. And understandably, existentially, from your experience, you see that a lot. But across the board, statistically, the overwhelming majority are not there. But even if it's just one family, it's one family too many. What we have to do is find a way to incentivize people to become their best selves, which goes way beyond what's just programmatic. You're talking about now historical, familial, cyclical pathology. You're talking about a lot of stuff that you have to drill way down into the weeds to get to where the derivational source was, where this dysfunction began, and how do you address it. For African American families, though oftentimes people in majority culture don't like to hear this, we still are dealing with the effects of slavery in our community. We actually are. And it was hard to believe, but it is true. The inability to transfer wealth because we never got the 40 acres and a mule. The inability to take hold of the political dream of being an American because of what happened in Jim Crow and Reconstruction. It's amazing that we're still dealing with a lot of cultural lag from the things that happened during that time. And that's not an excuse. That's just reality. And I think what we have to be careful of is that our, what is it, a cliche, the road to hell is paved with good intentions? I think a lot of times the social safety net programs, the intentions were good, but things didn't always turn out the way we had hoped that they would. And I think that that's true. We have to be honest about that. But the church or the faith community has to always go back to being transcendent. We do not, see, I as a progressive have to say to progressives, you need to get your head on straight about something, such as either change CPI or means testing Medicare or whatever the case might be, or just raising the eligibility age a couple of years. I, as a liberal, have to say that to liberals because they will not hear it coming from a conservative. But conservatives have to say to conservatives, military-industrial complex needs to be readdressed because you won't hear it from a liberal. That's how we become transcendent, when we are able to talk to our own groups and say, challenge yourselves. Can we think differently for the common good?
I agree with elements. I know the time is tight.
Last word, and I'm going to
you know, of what Reverend Newman said there in terms of transcending, and I think, evangelicals have to say to their, locked arm libertarian friends, a legitimate, hand up social safety net is worth defending. I agree with that. I just think that there is a corrosive effect over time that happens when we have systems in place that motivate previously congregations who did a lot of this work a full century ago to sort of step back and say, oh, the government's doing it now. I pay taxes for that. And that is a problem because it becomes less relational, it becomes less organic and local, all the things that lead to ultimately health for this gentleman's neighbor, getting back out to the workforce.
We are at 1:30 and beyond, and I know there are several questions here, and I apologize, although the folks will maybe stay afterwards. Several of you mentioned a more educated American citizen here. I feel more educated, even enlightened, by this discussion. So please join me in saying thank you to our friends here. It shows the breadth and depth of the faith community in a variety of ways, I think, today, and the importance of as our nation wrestles with issues of fiscal policy, to recognize not just the moral dimensions, but also the voices that can help us move forward. And I think we've heard some of them here. So thank you, friends. We are adjourned.